Hello and welcome back to Political Debrief. I'm Josh Oliverio. Today, we're going to talk about Nunavut, Canada's northernmost territory. To many Canadians, Nunavut is a territory with beautiful mountains, small oceanside cities, and the home of deep cultural heritage. However, there's another lesser-known unique approach that Nunavut has, and that's their approach to territorial politics. Unlike all the provinces and Yukon, Nunavut and the Northwest Territories use a system called consensus government. Instead of parties and deep partisanship, everyone is independent. They are elected by their constituents, and then once they arrive at the Legislative Assembly of Nunavut, the 22 members elect a cabinet and premier. To talk about this system and why it might be a solution for other provinces and territories, I spoke with Adam Lightstone, who's a Nunavut MLA. Here's our conversation now. And Mr. Lightstone joins me now. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you again, Josh, for having me.
So a lot of my viewers might not know that much about you. So do you want to take a couple moments to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Adam Akayak Lightstone. I'm a member of the Legislative Assembly in Nunavut. This is my second term. I've been an MLA for 5 years now. And when I was first elected in 2017, I was the youngest MLA in our assembly. I was elected at 30, and I share that title as youngest MLA with one of my cabinet colleagues who was also elected at 30 in the previous election in 2013.
Do you think that your age and your young age going into the legislature, do you think that that had any impact on your experience as a first-time MLA?
Absolutely. So when you look around the table at elected officials in general across the country or the world, typically you'll see the average age is much more mature, 50s and sometimes 60s. And that's for good reason. When you're at this type of decision-making level, of course it's very important to have experience to enable you to ensure that the right decisions are being made. However, in democracy, it's also equally important to have equal representation. For example, it's very important to have equal representation at the gender level, but also at all other areas of demographics, ethnicity, religion, and whatnot. But also, what a lot of people don't take into consideration is it's also to have members of the younger generations at that decision-making table as well. When I was first elected at 30, sitting at a table where the average age was roughly 55, I didn't necessarily get all the attention or maybe respect that other members would receive. However, I brought my own unique perspectives and experience and qualifications to the table. Being a younger generation in Nunavut, where we have a very young population that's facing a lot of social issues, such as low levels of education and low levels of employment and high levels of poverty and food insecurity. I brought to the table my own knowledge and experience. After high school, I went on to college and university and worked in the territorial government for a number of years in finance. And that's something that was never really present at the table here in Nunavut's legislature. So I put in the time and the effort and work. And by the end of my first term, whenever I'd speak, I definitely got the attention and respect that we all deserve.
Before we move on to talk about our main topic for today, I'm just curious. Your aunt was Nunavut's second premier. So, how do you think that family connection has either prepared you or set high expectations? How does that family connection impact you?
Hi, thanks for the question, Josh. I see you've done your homework. So, yeah, when my aunt was the premier in 2008 to 2013, she was the second premier of Nunavut and the first female premier. At that time, I was very, very young, and I didn't really have much of an understanding of the significance she had played. I didn't have much interest in politics at all at that point, and it wasn't until much later that I really started getting interested. Now realizing, what she had done, it's I definitely have a lot more admiration for her contribution.
So now let's move on to our main topic of discussion, what connected us. Consensus government. And I think that a lot of people in Canada are used to the idea of you got a Liberal Party, you got a Conservative Party, they fight all the time, and the only time it really matters what happens is during an election. How does the system that not just Nunavut uses, but also the Northwest Territories uses, how does that system change the way that politics works at the territorial level?
Our consensus-based model is uh, something that's close and dear to all of us here in Nunavut. It is um, based on and much closer to Inuit traditional decision making, and which was based on cooperation and respect. So there's, of course, the biggest differentiation between consensus and political party system is that, well, I guess first, there is no parties. We're all elected as independents, and the way that our government is formed and priorities are set are also much different.
So let's go into a little bit more depth on that. How do you think that it impacts the political system? Do you think that it's better? Do you think that it might be a downgrade from what the provinces and the Yukon uses? What are your thoughts on the system?
So I'm grateful for our consensus model. Um, you know, when I was preparing for my first campaign, I was able to listen to the needs of the community and develop my own platform. And throughout my political career, I'm able to raise any concerns that I or my constituents have. And there's no need to toe a party line, and there's no restrictions on the types of questions or concerns and comments that I can raise in public. So, I am grateful for our consensus system. However, I do believe and recognize that there are some drawbacks, as we are all independent members representing our own communities and constituencies. It is very challenging to seek support from my fellow members on specific instances or issues, and that's where uh, I can definitely appreciate to the benefit of having a party system.
That was going to be my next question. Is does legislation move through a lot slower because you've got a bunch of individual MLAs that have their own concerns, needs that their constituencies have? How does that impact the timeline of, a bill?
Well, it really depends on the bill itself. Um, there are some very significant pieces of legislation that go through standing committee review and passing in the legislative assembly, and then there are minor amendments that that can go through fairly quickly. And on a number of occasions, there have been bills that have been passed in our legislative assembly on the same day that they were introduced.
What happens if we get to a situation with a bill where no one can agree, where the cabinet is voting one way, they feel one way, but all these other individual independent members feel a separate way and there's a divide? How does that get resolved?
Well, that hasn't does not happen very often. So when we're reviewing a particularly significant bill, there's much more collaboration between the committee and the sponsoring department or minister, and there's a significant amount of letter writing back and forth, addressing our concerns and hearing the responses from the minister. And quite often, um, the minister will either explain the rationale as to why the bill is written that way, or the minister will introduce uh, friendly amendments to the bill that is passed through standing committee through way of motion, and the amendments are made that way. But there's also been instances where there's been unfriendly amendments, where the minister or the minister does not agree to committee's concerns and recommendations, and the bill is introduced to the House for third reading as is, and unfriendly amendments can be made through motion, and members can vote um, to strike or amend clauses within the bill that way.
On this podcast, we like to talk about the issues in Canadian, but also provincial and territorial politics, and how they affect youth. And I'm curious whether you think that this system helps amplify the voices and concerns of young people across the territory.
I believe that it does, and it is increasingly more recently as well. In Nunavut, we're a territory with a very young population. Uh, More than half of our population is under the age of 20, and we are seeing youth get more active and conducting demonstrations with issues that impact them. We've had rallies here in Iqaluit within the last few years with regards to significant issues such as suicide and the high rates of suicide in the territory. We've also had youth demonstrate their concerns over the climate crisis and inaction to address climate change. However, I sort of mentioned earlier about um, the majority of politicians being of an older generation. And um, again, I just really want to reiterate how important it is to have diversity at the decision-making table, especially having younger politicians at the table as well. When I had first entered politics as an MLA, I found out that my own views differed drastically from that of my older counterparts on a number of specific issues. So I think it is very important that youth have their voice at all arenas, um, whether it's municipal or provincial and territorial or federal. And there's a number of ways that can be done. Youth can form and gather and share their concerns directly with politicians, or youth can step up and put their name in the hat and ensure that their voices are heard.
If you were tasked with suggesting some improvements to the system that can be made, what would you say?
Improvements to the consensus model.
Yeah, like improvements to the system that the territory uses right now.
At this time, I don't think I would be able to provide any recommendations for improvements to our specific consensus model system. Um, I think it has a lot of benefits with very little negatives. Um, so, one of the most significant aspects that differentiates our assembly and the consensus model that we use with that of the party systems is uh, the level of decorum that we maintain. So earlier I mentioned that I had no interest in politics at a young age, and that is because when I was a teenager, I had an opportunity to go to Ottawa and visit Parliament Hill. And I remember I was up in the visitors gallery, and I just um, walked in and found my seat, and I just all the MPs were down in the chamber, and I couldn't believe my eyes. The MPs, all these adults, were in the room, and they're all yelling and um, being completely disrespectful amongst each other. Then the speaker walks in and calls the House to order, and they proceed through the session. And I I just couldn't believe my eyes how this level of disrespect just continued through heckling and interruptions and just complete and utter disrespect. When I first walked in to the visitors gallery in Parliament Hill, I and saw these adults behaving in such a way, I just couldn't help but think they're acting like children in a schoolyard. And from that point on, I was just completely turned away from politics. And it wasn't until much older that I started getting more in tuned with issues impacting my community and my territory, and started getting more interested in policies and government and what I can do to make changes that are required. So those that level of uh, decorum and disrespect and isn't limited to Parliament Hill. It's seems like it's commonplace in all legislative assemblies across the provinces. And I don't know if that's tied to the party system itself or just the customs and traditions that have evolved in our assemblies and in Parliament. But that is, what I'm so grateful of our own consensus system is that there's no heckling, there's no yelling or interruptions, or there's very rarely any interruptions. And I don't think I've ever had to hear our speaker call order or calling the House to order, trying to get members to settle down and get back in their seats.
So I live in Ontario, where we have 124 members of our legislature, which is a lot more than Nunavut, right? Do you think that this system could be applied to the larger provinces like Quebec and BC and Ontario?
In theory, yes, I definitely believe that a consensus model system could be applied to a much larger jurisdiction. However, I think it would be. I think the most challenging aspect would be implementing and electing members on an independent basis.
Awesome. I had just have a couple more questions, and we'll go away from the consensus government topic now. What do you think is the biggest challenge that Nunavut's youth face right now?
So there's a wide range of issues impacting the territory and including youth. So right now, we have the quickest growing population in Canada. We also have a very limited economy, very few jobs that are available in our communities. So we have high levels of poverty, high levels, uh, low levels of education, and that's coupled with overcrowding or housing crisis, which is you see households with multi-generational families living all in one under one roof. 3 bedroom with 12 or 15 people living in there, a whole family living in a bedroom, sort of thing. And that leads to the food insecurity, very high levels of food insecurity. And there have been studies that have shown that 50% of youth in Nunavut are facing food insecurity. They don't have sufficient food in their homes, and I think that, coupled with all of the other issues, social issues that are tied to poverty and low levels of education, such as domestic violence and child abuse and intergenerational trauma that have been a legacy of residential schools. We have adults coping through substance abuse, self-medicating, whether it's alcohol or drugs, and youth see that and sort of replicate that. So it's we have a multitude of issues that are impacting our youth.
And my last question for you today, if you had to go back to when you were, we'll say 15 or 16, do you have any advice that you would give yourself?
Yeah. So if I were able to speak to my 15-year-old self, I would say, plan your life, set goals and objectives. If you don't have a plan, you'll never be able to achieve your expectations. So yeah, I would say sit down and try and plan your life, and watch yourself achieve those objectives and feel like you're making accomplishments. In addition, I guess I would also say, take time to read and stay up to date with current events. That's something that is very important in general, whether you're adult or youth or utilizing programs and services. It's important to be up to date in media, as well as going the extra mile and reading policies that have an impact on your life.
Awesome. Mr. Lightstone, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Josh, and it's so great to see someone taking the initiative at such an early age, and look forward to hearing more of or listening to some more of your podcasts.
And that's it for this edition of Political Debrief. I hope you enjoyed. As always, I would invite you to leave a comment on our website or down below on YouTube. Give me your thoughts about the episode. What do you think about consensus government? Do you think that bigger provinces or territories should adopt it? And also, please consider subscribing and following us on all of our social media platforms. Those links are down below. That's it for this episode of Political Debrief. Thank you so much for joining me.